Hello everyone, I hope that you can see and hear me. Welcome to tonight's special meeting of the Wharfedale Naturalists together with the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. A first joint meeting, but hopefully not the last. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to go through one or two points to do with the Zoom platform in case we've got people here tonight who aren't all that familiar with it. Plus, you know, we're operating it in our own particular way for the purposes of this meeting. So just so that everybody's clear, I'm going to go through one or two of the basics. So the first thing to say is you can't be seen and also you can't be heard by default in this meeting. The only people you'll see are me and the speaker, Sara, and from time to time also Jeff. That doesn't mean, however, that you can't participate. Indeed, we hope that you will participate. If you wiggle your cursor around, a ribbon will appear at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see that there's a chat button there. Not the Q&A button, but the chat button is what we're going to be using to collect questions for the end of the session. What we'd like to encourage you to do, which worked very well in our last meeting, is to write your questions as they occur during the talk on the chat screen. And then at the end of the session, Jeff will have had a chance already to sort of collate the questions, make sure that there aren't any, you know, duplicates and that sort of thing. And we'll ask the speaker a selection of the questions. So I hope everybody's understood that and that that's all right. I can see from the bottom of my screen that we now have 107 participants tonight. Well, that's 107 logins, so perhaps more participants actually, because some people will of course be partners and families watching together. So I think we can be very pleased at the size of that audience. I was hoping we would break the 100 barrier, and so it has proved, so that's fantastic. It's not surprising, of course, given the topic of tonight's talk. We're very lucky to have with us Sara King here. She's an ecologist. She specialises in biodiversity monitoring and assessment. She's been monitoring both beaver and pine marten reintroduction sites across England and Wales, and she's been working with rewilding projects for the last 5 years. She's passionate about using data to educate and change conservation practices for the benefit both of people and, of course, the wildlife concerned. She's recently joined Rewilding Britain, and she's tasked with developing their new Rewilding Network, which is aimed at bringing projects and local networks together for knowledge sharing and upscaling the rewilding that's taking place. And tonight she's going to present to us data from her biodiversity monitoring project work, both on beaver and on pine marten sites. And she's going to share some information with us about approaches to monitoring, including about the technology that's used to assist with cost-effective surveys. And the data presented, she tells us, is currently in the process of being published by a scientific journal. So we are going to be privileged to hear material that's at the very cutting edge of science that hasn't yet even reached the journal. So without further ado, Sara, let me hand over to you. Welcome, and I'm sure everyone's going to really enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I'll just share my screen. Just bear with me. Okay, so thank you for tuning in tonight, and hopefully I can give you a good overview of some of the work that I was doing looking at the biodiversity impacts of beavers and pine marten reintroductions. This project was funded by a company that I used to work for called Ecosouls. They're an ecological consultancy and a habitat restoration company, mostly based in the southwest, but through their research and development internal funds that they had, we were able to start to develop some of these techniques and try to change the way that we monitor the impacts of some of these species. So a lot of the stuff that I'll be presenting today was research funded by them. Just a little bit about me, just so that you know a bit about my background. So I worked for Ecosouls for 12 years. I was a senior ecological consultant with them, and then I specialised in biodiversity and assessment and monitoring for 4 years. So we were looking at species reintroductions, but we also looked at trying to develop ways to monitor rewilding projects. So as I've already said, the research presenting here was funded by the Ecosouls R&D department, and we are going to be publishing it hopefully in Ecological Indicators shortly. We're just finalising the paper following a review. And since June 2020, I've been working with Rewilding Britain as the network development lead. I'll talk a little bit about the next steps on the network at the end of this presentation, but really it is just trying to bring together communities and trying to knowledge share. So my background is mostly ecology, but I do have a little bit of background in some of the rewilding projects, and also obviously some of the species that I'm going to talk about today. So a little bit about rewilding in Britain. Why do we need to look at rewilding? I'm sure I don't need to tell you the reason why we might need to consider rewilding as one tool in the arsenal to try and solve, or at least mitigate for, the climate and ecological emergencies that we're facing at the moment. The state of nature reports that we've seen recently have shown dramatic declines in wildlife. We know that climate change is affecting a lot of our habitats and our seas as well as terrestrial land. And we can't basically keep doing what we're doing. Traditional conservation practices have their place and they are protecting our best habitats, but they're not enough in isolation, and we're providing too much pressure on our wildlife as things stand for those populations to be able to survive. So we need to look at something new, and rewilding is an option for this, and it's embracing natural processes, looking at how we can start to do large-scale rewilding, restore natural processes. And part of this is considering species reintroductions, because there are some functional species that are missing from Britain, and without them we end up having to try to take the place of them and recreate the impacts and the functions that they provide. And often we don't necessarily do as good a job as the species themselves, so why not consider looking at species reintroductions? Beavers in particular have been in the news a lot recently. We've seen a lot more trial sites in the last year or so alone, really. When I first started looking at beaver projects, it was 2015, and there were only 1 or 2 projects really in Britain at that point. And then since then, we've seen the number expand. And you'll see on your screen the map is taken from the Beaver Trust website that shows all of the licensed release sites with the red pins, and all the known illegal release sites with the green pins, I believe. But you can see that there's quite a good spread. There's quite a good spread of projects around Britain. We've got the Scottish wild populations. We've also got lots of enclosure sites, including one in Yorkshire. And although we've seen a lot of these beaver releases, we've also seen that a lot of them are within enclosures. So there's only 2 official wild populations in Britain, one down in Devon, the River Otter trial, and they've been recently told that those beavers are allowed to stay now that the trial's finished. And we've got the other population up in Scotland on the River Tay. So the projects that I was working on were mostly enclosure sites. We didn't really work up in Scotland, and we didn't really work on any of the wild populations in Devon. So it really gave us a much easier way to monitor the impacts of beavers, because we could say these enclosure sites are where beavers are present, and then we could have control sites outside the enclosure to compare with. So it made it a little bit easier because we knew exactly where the beavers were and the habitats that they were affecting. But it's not necessarily the best option, and one of the motivations behind the work that we were doing was to try and collect some data and build an evidence base so that that could then be used to inform policy, and hopefully eventually encourage a few more wild populations to be allowed and allow beavers to be a bit more widespread in Britain than they currently are. We also then started looking at pine martens and the impacts that they have on biodiversity, and for this we looked at 2 wild release sites, one in Mid Wales with the Vincent Wildlife Trust, which has been established for a few years now, And the other one that's only just started, I think it was this year, in the Forest of Dean. So they've only just started releasing individuals there. For the Forest of Dean, we were collecting lots of baseline data before the pine martens were released. And again, really, it was just to try and build that evidence base and look at new techniques to collect the data so that we could really start to put some evidence behind a lot of these projects. So why do we need to measure? Why do we need to even look at it? We know that in Britain there is a lot of monitoring that is done on a lot of our sites, but often it's not really very standardized. And we tend to look at things that maybe we want to, or look at things that we have the expertise for. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't necessarily build a comprehensive evidence base. For example, you could have university students who want to get involved and do a project on your site, and they might look at something very specific for 3 or 4 years. And then you might have another student that comes in and looks at something slightly different after that. So to get this continuum of data is sometimes really hard. And without that, it's difficult to then start to look at common trends and see how things are being affected. So even in the case of rewilding and species reintroductions, a lot of the time we as ecologists think we know what's best for that habitat, and we think we know that it's going to improve biodiversity, but we don't necessarily know how to show it without using anecdotal evidence. So one of the things that was really important when we first started looking at this project was trying to make sure that we were measuring things in a consistent way. We were able to compare data between sites, and we could start to show that these trends were associated with that particular intervention, that particular rewilding project, or that particular species. Because we just can't afford to assume that what we're doing now is going to benefit biodiversity. We're facing an ecological crisis, and we can't really waste any time doing something on guesswork. So it's good to get started, and it's good to do something on the ground, but if we can start to measure the impact that has, it will give us a much better evidence base going forward. And we know that we have the tools and the approaches to help increase our evidence base. We did a lot of work not only looking at what the suitable indicators would be, but also looking at how we can start to involve other people with collecting that data. Some of it might need specialist ecologist or specialist survey techniques, but we tried to develop it so that a lot of it would be able to use volunteers and technology so that we could then get some really good data, but people were going out and seeing the difference and seeing the changes and actually experience some of these areas. And we also developed a framework not only for beavers and pine martens that I'm going to talk about tonight, but we also started developing a framework for other functional species. Like in the picture here, we've got some Tamworth pigs at Knepp doing what they do best and rootling around and disturbing the ground. And this in itself is a natural process. So we should measure the impact it's having on species and biodiversity. So back to, we'll start focusing on beavers, and then I'll talk about pine martens. The beaver studies were much more extensive than the pine marten studies, so I'll probably focus a little bit more on beavers. And beavers is the subject of the paper that we're going to be publishing, so we've got a little bit more data on that. So we worked on quite a few different beaver sites. We worked on 6 or 7 beaver projects, and we were monitoring them all in the same way. And beavers have a massive impact on their environment. Pretty much as soon as they are released into an enclosure, you start to see and hear their impact. They'll start by creating these impressive dam structures within even the narrowest of streams to start to backfill and create these ponds and standing water and wetlands. And not only through that, creating the standing water, but they'll also go and they'll fell a lot of the material to create the dams. So that will open up lots of new areas, creating much more light coming through from the canopy than you would in a closed canopy forest. They also then start gnawing down the trees, as you can see in one of these pictures. They create a load of wood chips on the ground, they create dead wood. They'll use the tree material to then start building their lodges and their dams. And they'll also then start just to create, basically hold water. So they'll create these wetland systems, they'll dig out canals to move their material. You end up in quite a small enclosure, seeing quite a big difference in a very short space of time. With the projects that we were studying, a lot of the changes we were seeing within the first year of beavers being put in there. And this makes it really exciting from a monitoring perspective, because we can start to collect results in quite a small space of time. But it also means we have to get out there and collect the baseline data pretty fast before the beavers are introduced. Otherwise you miss your chance and they're already having an impact. So just in terms of just talking you through this slide, in the top corner we can see a beaver dam. This is in the project in the Forest of Dean quite early on, where they've started to try and dam up quite a narrow ditch and stream with really, really steep banks actually. So they've started to create these dams to try and hold back the water, and then this starts to flood some of the surrounding areas. The top middle is a beaver print, beaver footprint that we also found in the Forest of Dean, with a 5 pence in there just for scale. The photo on the right you can see is from a site in Carmarthenshire in Wales, where we were doing some monitoring. And that tree was sat right next to the fence line, so we did have to advise that maybe they need to be a bit careful, because beavers do have a bit of a reputation for being escape artists. And then down at the bottom are 2 pictures from the Devon enclosure site that we were working on, where the beavers had been there for quite a long time, and it was quite well established, which was great for us because we could use these projects that had different stages of reintroductions, and we could then start to look at how quickly things change. And this is just a photo just so that you can start to see, if anyone hasn't been to a site where there's beavers, this is quite a good photo that I took quite early on in my studies down at the Devon site, just to kind of show what a river system can look like when beavers are there. And this was once a really narrow stream that went through a really heavily wooded area. And since the beavers were there, we can start to see so much change. So you can see the standing water in the center of the photo. That is sitting behind a beaver dam that some of you might be able to just see the edge of. That sits at about 1.5 meters, so it's a really significant structure. And then you can see where they've been felling some of the trees to create the material to build that dam. You can see these meadows appearing, and some of them are wet meadow habitats and some of them are a bit drier, but that's because the canopy started to open up. You just create this real variability of habitats, from wetlands to meadows to then you've still got some wooded areas. They don't take down all the trees. And we have standing deadwood and deadwood on the ground, and we've just got a real rich variety of habitats. And this is why beavers are referred to as ecosystem engineers, because they get in there and they really change and manipulate these river corridors. You don't see this change quite so much down at lower levels, where the river is already quite wide, because they can't create dams on rivers down at lower levels, but also they don't need to because they've already got the water there. So we tend to see this sort of behavior where the stream's really narrow, or you haven't got so much water. So just a little bit about how we designed the monitoring strategy for the beaver projects. We started by reviewing a whole load of published articles and papers from Europe, but also from America, about what the impacts of beavers are on their habitats. And then we used this published information to then liaise with stakeholders who were working within these projects, to start to talk to them about what sort of indicators we could select as a standardized framework. And from that review and from that liaison, we then pulled out 3 main indicators that can show the change that beavers have. Now, we could have measured a lot of things, but you can't measure everything. So the process that we went through was really just trying to look at what are the best indicators to give us some really good quality data about how beavers are affecting biodiversity within that system. And through this review, we selected aquatic invertebrates because that's an obvious indicator of change. We know that beavers manipulate aquatic habitats. We selected bats because this can give us a good indication of change in prey abundance, but also change in habitat variability and connectivity and habitat type. And we also selected bryophytes, so these are mosses, because they are great indicators of environmental conditions and environmental change. And so the 3 of these together provided us a really good data set that could show us all the change that was happening. We also used a tool that was developed by Ecosouls and by one of their associate directors, Dr. Alan Feast, who used to work for the University of Bristol, called the Biodiversity Quality Calculator. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this in this presentation, but essentially the calculator will provide us information on a whole range of different indices. So we didn't just look at species richness, but we looked at things like biomass, abundance of populations, the evenness of a population, how dominated it was by one common species, species rarity. And this started to give us a really big picture of what was actually happening rather than just relying on one indicator alone. We also then started to look at how can we collect this data, and we didn't want it to just be specialist ecological survey work. We wanted to involve communities, and we were really lucky because actually a lot of the technology is there to help us collect this data within the community. So we use up in the top right, you can see an Anabat bat detector. We use these static bat detectors to collect our bat data. They're really easy to set up, and we were able to then post these detectors out to the project teams, and they could use their volunteers or the project coordinator to put these detectors out into specific locations. And they can use the GPS to then automatically establish when dusk and dawn times are, and you can set them to just record during the night. So we sent these out, and they were put out, and we could collect a lot of data from them at different sample points. And that data was then sent back to us with the detectors, and we were able to analyze it using software. So there is some specialist requirement from this, but it meant that we could seriously reduce the time that was needed of specialist ecologists on site through using this technology. We also try to use citizen science wherever we can. So down in the bottom right corner, you can see me in the stream in the Forest of Dean beaver enclosure, teaching the volunteers there how to do kick sampling for aquatic invertebrates. And what we did is we did these kick samples, we emptied the samples out into a white tray, we took all the invertebrates out and put them into a pot, and then we sent them off for DNA barcoding. So this meant that we didn't need to have a specialist invertebrate surveyor on site to collect all the samples. They could be replicated, but we used the lab to make sure that the accuracy of that data was really high. So we didn't have to worry about training volunteers or surveyor bias. When it came to the bryophytes, we did need to use specialist surveys because the technology isn't quite there, but we managed to use volunteers to collect most of the other data. And then we know that we've got access to things like drones and satellite imagery. So down in the bottom left is a drone image of the Devon Beaver enclosure site, which University took. And you can really start to use this to map changes in habitat extent. You can look at heights of vegetation. You can see where the dams are. Might be able to just about make out some of the water bodies and the dams on that. And then you can really start to see what's changing over time. You can overlay this into GIS. We can overlay our sample and monitoring results on top of this to get a really great picture of what's actually happening. And this can give us just a really good idea and a picture of what's going on, but it also means that in the long term, these sites don't need us to carry on the monitoring. Anyone can carry on doing that. And that was really important to us to make sure that citizen science and volunteers could take this forward. So I'm going to go into some of the results. This is just a top level overview of what we saw. There's a lot more data behind this, but I didn't want to share loads of numbers with you this evening because I think maybe the participant number would have gone down quite significantly if I did. So this is just a top level overview, but I'd be happy to discuss in more detail if anyone has any questions on this. So this is a graph showing the change in bryophyte data at one of our sites down in Devon. And basically what we did is we looked at the bryophyte samples before and after. So the teal coloured bars are before and the grey coloured bars are after beavers were there. And we started to look at the environmental attributes of all of the bryophyte species that we've recorded. And this can give us information about what's happening. So if we start on the left, we can see that the number of bryophytes associated with shade has decreased slightly. And the number of bryophytes associated with well-lit habitats has increased once beavers are there. And again, this isn't something that we would expect this because beavers are going in there, they're felling those trees, they're creating these more open areas, they're bringing light through to the ground. So it's not unexpected at all. We can also see that we've got more bryophytes associated with both dry and waterlogged areas. Again, not a surprise because we'd expect to see this as we get more wetlands and waterlogs and holding the water back into the enclosure. If we take you to the end of this graph, one of the interesting finds that we found with bryophytes was that we had more bryophytes associated with infertile soils once beavers were introduced. And then we saw no bryophytes associated with fertile soils at all post-beaver introduction. And we started to match this up to some of the other data that was being collected by University. And they were finding that essentially the beaver pools and the standing water that's created act as nutrient sinks. So even though this enclosure was surrounded by farmland, a lot of the runoff from that farmland was then going into the standing water and then sinking down with the sediments and being locked in. So it wasn't going out of the system. And we started to see this with bryophyte data, that we basically didn't have any fertile soils in that enclosure anymore, which is again really good for plant diversity and diversity of a lot of other wildlife as well. So let's have a look at the impacts on bats. The bats was probably the most interesting and significant impact throughout all of the monitoring that we were doing. And we found this not just across one site, but this was the trend that we found across all of the sites that we were looking at. This is just a graph that looks at one element of it, but essentially what we're seeing here is at the start of the graph, we've got the baseline of site 1. So we did have some bats on the site, but not too many. As we start to have beavers being reintroduced in 2012, we then start to see a significant increase in the number of bats compared to the control. So the black bars are the enclosure where beavers are present, and the grey bars are the control sites where beavers aren't present but still have similar habitats. And the biomass, so this is indicating the total number of bats that we have visiting this area, goes up significantly, up all the way to over 12,000 grams in the system, which, considering this is a small isolated enclosure, is really significant. So we were seeing lots more bats come to this site, and that was within 3 years of beavers being there. We also saw this specifically on the Devon site. So not only, this is another graph that shows the increase in biomass as the bars. So we know that there's more bats visiting the enclosure, but something that was really interesting was not only were we having more bats, but we were also having rarer bats. So the line on this graph shows the species rarity of the bats in the area, and that increased as well. And this is really exciting, because if we imagine this on a Britain scale, if beavers were widespread, then we're looking at significant nature recovery if we put this at scale. These are just enclosure sites, so they're only a couple of hectares big. And finally, the impact on invertebrates. Aquatic invertebrates were much slower to change. We started seeing some higher species turnover. So this is the change in species composition on the site. And this was mainly because of the anticipated change from just flowing water to standing water, but also possibly an improvement in water quality. So we saw different species moving into the system, which is what we would expect to see as natural processes start to come in. We also found a higher species richness, indicating that there's more opportunities for more species, which again is explained by the increase in wetlands and standing water. But we didn't really find any change in biomass or population evenness. And we weren't sure whether this was just because maybe the aquatic invertebrates just take a little bit longer to change, and that they don't quite show the same speed of change that you would with bats. So just going back to the earlier picture that I showed you and trying to run through the kind of findings that we had, putting it in the context of this picture. So bryophytes, we knew that the pools, like the one we've got in this picture, they act as nutrient sinks. So as the beavers slow the flow of the water, the sediment then drops and locks in a lot of these pollutants and nutrients into that bed of that pool, stopping them from then leaching out into the wider area. So we see more biodiversity from that. We also know that the bats' abundance and the biomass, as well as the species rarity, increased significantly. And if we look at this picture, it's not hard to really see why that is. We've got so much more habitat variability here than a closed canopy single stream system. We've got these warm grassland meadows, we've got standing water, we've got deadwood. All of these create great habitats for terrestrial invertebrates. And it's these terrestrial invertebrates that are then increasing in abundance, which is then bringing more bats into the system to forage. So again, imagine this on a much larger scale and the impact that that would have not only on our terrestrial invertebrates that we know are struggling, but also on our bat populations. And with invertebrates, as we go from a single narrow stream within a woodland to these more wetland areas and canals, we start to see that species turnover of aquatic invertebrates and also species richness does increase, because we can start to see more opportunities for them. And that just means that more biodiversity is within this system and nature is actually bouncing back and recovering. And I think that's really interesting. As ecologists, we probably knew that beavers had this impact, but it's going back to what is the evidence base. And now that we can show, by using a standardized monitoring framework, that these trends are found across multiple beaver sites, regardless of their location or habitat, we can start attributing these trends to the beavers themselves and use that as an evidence base to inform policy and future reintroductions. That's beavers. I'm just going to do a little bit on pine martens. As I said, we haven't done quite as much detailed work on pine martens, mainly because our sampling is a little bit restricted, but I will give you some information about the work that we were doing on those. So pine martens are much harder to monitor. I've put a map in here of the area that pine martens have been covering from the Vincent Wildlife Trust project. You can see that they cover a much larger area. We're looking at a lot of proportion of whales to try and monitor, because they move around a lot, and these guys aren't being moved into enclosures, they're going to be moved into wild areas. Their impacts are also quite subtle, and a lot of the projects that we're working on at the moment are releasing quite small populations. So we haven't got as many pine martens in these areas. It takes a while for the population to recover and settle, and so they're just much harder to monitor the impacts from a biodiversity perspective. We know from some studies that they may benefit red squirrels through the predation of grey squirrels. But one of the things that we really wanted to look at was that there was a lot of concern around the potential impact on breeding birds, specifically nesting woodland birds. So that was something that we wanted to have a look at, not only from the Vincent Wildlife Trust perspective, but also from the Forest of Dean. So to do this, we expanded our sampling approach a little bit more. So we selected standard 1 kilometre squares throughout the areas where pine marten presence was confirmed. And then we assigned some control plots that supported similar woodland habitats, but where pine martens hadn't been recorded. Now we have to take that with a pinch of salt, because pine martens are actually in a lot of places that haven't been recorded. But for the purpose of this study, we assumed that they were either not there or in very low numbers. We used bioacoustic bat detectors. So I showed you earlier in the presentation the bat detectors that we used. We used a similar version of that, but for bird monitoring. And these record all of the bird songs using these static detectors, and then we can again take them back and do the analysis of that in the office, so it can give us quite a lot of data about what's happening. But BTO were also kind enough to share their data with us, which meant that we could use their 1 kilometre sampling squares, and they had data, I think they shared it with us for about 20 years, so we had a big data set for this, so that we could start to use that to show trends. We also did some static bat detector monitoring to try and measure whether there was any impact on habitat structure when pine martens were present. And we also looked at bryophytes in the Forest of Dean. And this is just a picture. This was near the Brecon Beacons, where I was doing some pine marten transects last year, I think it was, trying to look to see whether there were any evidence of pine martens. And this is a typical habitat that you would expect to see pine martens in. They like to use tree canopy cover to move around. They like to predate on woodland birds, eggs. They predate on squirrels, sometimes small mammals, but they are usually in quite low density, so it is usually pretty difficult to spot them. And in terms of our findings, this is really a study that still is continuing, because a lot of the projects are quite early on in their stage. It's quite difficult to draw any kind of conclusions from it. But we analysed the BTO data using the biodiversity quality calculator to show the changes in species rarity, species numbers, biomass, all the stuff we were measuring for beavers. And what we found, specifically on the Vincent Wildlife Trust project, was that after 2 years of pine marten reintroduction to the areas that they were putting them in, we didn't find a crash in breeding bird numbers. The species richness stayed the same throughout that project. So we didn't see an initial crash. We didn't see any increase or anything, but that's fine because the main concern was looking at a crash in breeding bird numbers. And as I said, the study needs to continue to then see whether that carries on or not. But one of the findings that was actually quite interesting when we started looking at biomass was that the biomass of birds did reduce where pine martens were present, and we didn't see this reduction where in our control plots where pine martens were absent. So we started to have a look at what could possibly be affecting the biomass but not actually the species richness. And what we kind of came to the conclusion of, but we obviously need to test this with a little bit more data, is that maybe the pine martens are predating on some of the larger birds like wood pigeons, which would explain the reduction in biomass, but they're not actually affecting the overall species richness or the overall evenness of the population because they're just predating on these common birds. Again, we need to do a little bit more analysis once the pine martens have settled in and expanded a little bit more to actually see whether that's the case. And we also need to see if this trend is also happening in the Forest of Dean. The Forest of Dean, we've collected a lot of baseline data for that on the same basis, but they've only just started releasing martens into the area. So really we need to see how this is going to pan out over the next couple of years, maybe a little bit longer, use the bird data to really start to see the impact it's having. But yeah, the initial results from this study was that they don't seem to be affecting breeding bird numbers in any catastrophic way, but they might just be bringing some of the biomass down a little bit where they're starting to predate on some of the bigger birds. So that's a little snapshot of the monitoring that we've been doing and in terms of what's next. So I've already mentioned, hopefully we will be publishing the Beaver results into a paper with ecological indicators in the next few months. I'm just making the amendments following the review to that paper. So hopefully we can provide a little bit more detail about some of the monitoring works we've been doing and then use that hopefully to provide a bit of an evidence base to some of the Beaver discussions that are happening at the moment. I have, as was introduced, just joined the Rewilding Britain team. So I've been there since June and I'm helping to launch the new Rewilding Network. So we're launching our website at the end of next week, which is going to have a whole load of new rewilding content about how to rewild, what is rewilding. We're also going to be launching the first phase of our network, which is going to have a map that shows all of the rewilding projects in Britain and a little bit of a profile about what they're doing and how they've approached it. And we're also going to have a map of local rewilding networks or local groups, which will include the Yorkshire Rewilding Network to try and signpost people to their local network if they're interested in rewilding and getting involved or joining up with other landowners. And then the next phase of the network that I'm working on is really to start to build some practical tools to help build this community. So it will include things like discussion forums, events, more technical publications. We're also developing some mapping tools to help projects on the ground to map out their project area and look at maybe what species they might want to reintroduce, what herbivore numbers might be best to reintroduce, whether natural regeneration would work or tree planting, and how that could potentially link to elms payments. So we're trying to make sure that the network's as useful as possible to bring people together, build that community and have that discussions, provide a bit of a support network for anyone who's doing rewilding, but also just start to create some tools that can help on the ground. And then linked to that, and also I guess linked to this presentation, is that we're also looking to work with different stakeholders, including Derbyshire Wildlife Trust and others, to start developing a new monitoring framework. We're hoping to develop a bit of a framework that will help us to collect data from all the rewilding projects in our network, not only biodiversity, but also economic, ecosystem services, and really start to build this evidence base of how rewilding is affecting biodiversity, how it's affecting people, how is it affecting ecosystem services like carbon capture. And if we can build this evidence base of what's happening on the ground, hopefully that can then help to inform whether rewilding is a tool that we should be using for the ecological and climate emergency, or whether something else is more effective. So yeah, we're a few months off that, but it is something we're trying to develop so that we can really start to build this evidence base and bring in this framework for a bit more standardization with the monitoring. And that will also include, hopefully, the use of technology, but also the use of citizen science, because we couldn't have done the monitoring on these projects without involving citizen science. So yeah, that's what we're looking forward to in the future. And hopefully we'll start to get some more results like we have on the beaver and pine marten projects to really start to show the benefits of rewilding. And again, I just want to say thank you to Ecosouls for funding this research, because it's been really great to be able to get out there and start to get some evidence together. So I think I'll stop sharing now and see if Jeff has some questions for me.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That's really illuminating from a quite detailed study, which I'm sure you could have covered for hours and hours and hours.
Oh, yes.
Great highlights. And I think we've got a very committed and educated audience, because there's more than a dozen questions. I'm glad you've left time for that. But I'll try and cover sort of the range of them. First one is the species reintroduced the same as was in the UK before we did away with them all?
Yeah, so there's two different genetic species of beavers. So there's the American beavers, and then there's the European ones. All of the beavers that get reintroduced in the projects in Britain are all tested to make sure that they're definitely the European beaver, and they're all subject to screening for disease and things like that. So they're definitely the species that would have been here however many hundreds of years ago.
Thank you. And is there any evidence of an impact on migratory spawning fish?
We didn't do any fish. It wasn't really in our area of expertise, and we knew there were a few other research projects that were centered around fish. So we specifically avoided the fish question. But I do believe there were some studies. I think there was a paper might be published this year looking at fish and showing that actually beaver pools where they're created can actually provide benefits to a lot of fish species, because they can use them as shelter and they can also use them as spawning areas. And the dams themselves, although they look quite solid and they do look like a barrier, they are leaky. You don't really come across a beaver dam that doesn't have water flowing out of it. So a lot of these dams, they do still allow fish to pass and jump over them because they are leaky, or they can go around the sides a lot of the time. And a lot of the fish species did evolve with beavers. So they do have that kind of inherent genetic ability to be able to get over a beaver dam. So I think a lot of this, there are still ongoing studies around that, but I think a lot of the research seems to be pretty positive that beavers and fish can coexist. And a lot of the time, actually, the pools and the wetlands they create can actually be of benefit to some of the species, as well as the water quality improvements that we see.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm glad nobody has asked if the beavers eat the fish, because
yes, that's good.
Not a rare misconception. What about regulation of beaver populations? Do populations tend to self-regulate, do you think? Is there a carrying capacity of the habitat? And
yeah,
the question is, are culls taking place in parts of the country, which I'll let you answer?
In Scotland, they are. Scotland's a little bit different. The beaver population on the River Tay is in an area that has quite good agricultural land. So there's quite a conflict there. It's not necessarily the best place that you would want to see beavers, because they are flooding this agricultural land and they are causing a few problems up there. So there are some culls that are happening to try and make sure that to mitigate the impact on farmland. But down in England, we don't have many wild populations at the moment. Most of them are contained in enclosures, but if they were put as wild populations, there's been a lot of studies, I think, by the University of Exeter, and I know the Beaver Trust are also looking to try and develop a national strategy of where beavers could go, what the carrying capacity is. Beavers are very territorial, so they will keep their territory, but in areas where there's a really good habitat, you'll have smaller territories. In areas where there's not so much good habitat, you will have these bigger territories. And they will start to fight if they have a territorial conflict. So I think maybe in the future, because there are no natural predators for beavers, unless we start to reintroduce wolf, which I think we're quite far away from at the moment, we will probably have to start culling them if they're widespread. But we've got hardly any wild populations at the moment, so it's going to be quite a few years before beavers will naturally become that widespread that we have to start managing them. And there's a lot of mitigation that you can also put in to help with conflict as well. So I think there is going to have to be that management strategy, and we probably will have to regulate the populations, but we are very far away from that at the moment.
Thank you. And turning to pine martens for a moment, what predates pine martens?
Do you know what? Pine martens is something that I don't know that much about, and I don't think they really have very many natural predators. You might get foxes that could take them, but a lot of the time they do spend their time up in the canopies, so they're usually quite far away. I have seen birds of prey take pine marten before if they can get them, but they are pretty fast. So pine martens don't tend to have too many natural predators, but they are in really low numbers at the moment. So they're not in levels where they're starting to overtake any of these areas, and a lot of the time their population is linked to prey abundance, so they should get to a natural carrying capacity within those areas. But especially with the projects in Wales and the Forest of Dean, the kind of long-term plan is to try and connect up those populations, maybe through reforesting or nature recovery networks and things like that. So if we start to see these things as connected populations, then you can then see how they can then start to become a lot more widespread quite quickly as we start to create these wildlife corridors for them.
Great, thank you. And if you've talked about beavers and pine martens helping nature recovery, what species would you like to see return next?
That's a really tricky question. The maverick in me would love to see some of the predators coming back, especially lynx. Lynx are my personal favourite, but from a practical perspective, I think there are a lot of species we could start to try to bring back, but also think about the species that we have at the moment and how we manage them. So herbivores, for example, so even the horses that we have, pigs on the ground, having wild cattle populations that can spread over a much wider area would start to make a real impact on biodiversity. I mean, if anyone's been to Knepp, you can kind of see how these herbivores can start to interact and create these real dynamics. And if we can have a countryside that has more diverse herbivores that are grazing over a much wider area, and then we've got beavers helping our kind of river systems, then that would really start to bolster some of these natural processes. And I think we would really start to see a little bit more messiness in the countryside if we could start to change our practices slightly. But yeah, I would definitely love to see lynx coming back. But I think we're probably a few years off that before that happens, just to try and help with some of the deer populations, really. And then obviously I've just really spoken about terrestrial habitats, but another thing that we're looking at, especially in my role at the moment with the Rewilding Network, is to look at marine habitats. And there's so much potential for marine habitats to rewild and maybe bring back some of the iconic species that we would normally see in Britain's seas. So I just get really excited by the potential of what we could do. And it's not necessarily just about bringing back species, but it's about looking at the species we have and being a bit more accept them a little bit more and accept that diversity and messiness.
Lovely. Hear from me. Lots of news at the moment about tree planting and the pressure to increase woodland in the UK. Does the work you've done tell us anything about what age woodland has to be before beavers would use it as a habitat?
No, we haven't really done any of that, but I was at one of the beaver sites and it had a lovely tree planting area right next to the site where there was a wild population. And the beavers did go and just basically gnaw down all of the newly planted trees, much to the project manager's disgust, because they'd spent an awful lot of time planting these trees up. So yeah, I mean, beavers don't necessarily need mature trees, they just need trees that they can get building materials from. So you could have a newly planted woodland that could support beavers. And one of the things that they do is when they fell the trees, they kind of coppice it rather than fell it. So you do get new shoots that come out of anything where a beaver's felled. But obviously I wouldn't necessarily recommend tree planting next to an area where there's beavers, but the beavers themselves can generate a lot of natural regeneration, even in areas that don't necessarily have that much diversity. So I think tree planting does have a place, especially along river corridors if we're anticipating beavers are going to be there in the future. But we didn't do any studies on establishment of woodland. But the ex-university have done a lot on habitat suitability and how to score that, and they've done a bit of a strategy on how many beaver families could be supported within catchment. So that might be a place to check for that kind of detailed information.
Thank you. And do you think it's likely that the government will allow the release of free-living ear tag-free beavers anytime soon?
Oh, I really hope so. We were waiting for the news on the Devon population on the River Otter, and the guys down there did a great job and managed to get the government to agree that they could stay, which was fantastic news. And I think it's just a case of hopefully the government deciding that it just makes sense to have beavers. We've got all of the we know how to mitigate beaver impacts, we know how to manage them, we've got all these strategy documents on which areas could take them. We know that there's going to be some conflict if they're areas of agricultural land, but let's get something in place that means we can move problem beavers out the way, or we can put up the mitigation for them. So I really hope that we start to see them, because I think we really need beavers, not just from a biodiversity perspective, but we can see the impact they have on flood mitigation. We're trying to mimic beavers with natural flood management projects that are being paid for. Let's just get the beavers in to do it. So yeah, I am a bit biased, but from working with these animals and working on the projects, they just make such a positive impact on a lot of things. And if we make sure that we put the measures in place to mitigate any impacts and learn to live with their messiness, I think they could really transform our countryside. So yeah, I really, really hope that the government will let us not keep putting them in enclosures and actually get some widespread wild populations. But I don't know what the timescale is for that. With government, it does tend to take a long time.
Okay, I've got through most of the questions. They're just both between chat and the Q&A, so I'm just trying to see what we haven't covered yet. Going back to probably the last one, going back to the study, how did you select control sites and how did they compare in terms of habitat?
So what we did when we went to collect our baseline data is we did a bit of a habitat assessment of the pre-beaver habitats. And then we looked in the local area. We didn't want the control plots to be too far away. So often we had some control plots that were adjacent and then some that were a bit further away. And we basically just looked for similar habitats. And so what we did is we collected the same baseline data from where the enclosure was, and then also these control plots. And then, yeah, we just carried on monitoring them in the same way. The thing with control plots is you have to you can't always necessarily get a best fit, but by collecting the baseline data, we could use the analysis to then see whether they're supporting similar number of species, similar populations, and we made sure that they were a good match using the analysis and the baseline data before we then proceeded with them. So obviously there can be some variability, but we tried to get as best a match as we possibly could with the control plots to be able to compare the difference.
Thank you. And one final one before I invite Helen to sum up. It's appeared a couple of times, and I'm conscious we do have a few attendees from the national parks. What can we do in Yorkshire and where can we start?
Do you know what? I think if we're looking at beavers and pine martens, the best place to start is to start looking at the likes of the Beaver Trust. I know they've done a lot of work on where beavers could go. There is already a beaver trial happening. I think it's Forestry Commission have a beaver trial in Yorkshire that's looking at flooding. But my hope is that maybe we don't necessarily have to do the paperwork and the licenses for Yorkshire, but maybe if we get a government decision, we might be able to start putting some in place. But we can only do that once we start putting pressure on the government to do that. And I love the fact that, yeah, national parks are a great place. I was doing some work with some of the national parks on monitoring in my old role and how we can start collecting data on how things are changed. And I think they provide a great opportunity to try and, yeah, see if we can start getting some beavers and some rewilded landscapes in. But my hope is that maybe in Yorkshire and everywhere else. We wouldn't necessarily have to start putting the fencing up and do the enclosure, but maybe we can start seeing if we can get some wild populations through.
Lovely. Well, there are still a few questions, but time marches on. I think you've made a fantastic effort at answering those ones. So I'll pass over to Helen to sum up.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And thank you so much for that, Sarah. What an absolutely fabulous talk that was. I'm sure there must have been a collective sharp intake of breath, in particular when you showed the data on the bats. I mean, it's just so striking what an incredible impact they have had, obviously on insect numbers and thereby on bat numbers. Absolutely fascinating to see these specific results. But also, I think what you did was give us this fantastic insight into the science and the way it has to be done, and the difficulties. I mean, as you said, it's obvious, isn't it? You can't monitor everything. But I have to confess, you know, I hadn't really thought before about how you go about deciding then what to monitor in view of the fact that you can't monitor everything. And just hearing you talk through the way that you'd approach that task was just so fascinating. And I'm sure everyone in the audience here will have felt just the same. I do want to mention before we finish that I noticed in the slides that were playing at the start that the website of the new Rewilding Network, the address was up there, and there was a suggestion that if people had enjoyed the talk tonight, and I know that very, very many people will have enjoyed the talk tonight, including myself, that the network might be grateful if there's no membership fees at present. That's right, is it, Sarah?
I think that one was the Yorkshire Rewilding Network.
Yeah, that is the case for
Rewilding. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So if people were minded to make donations, I'm sure that will be a lovely thing to do and very welcome. Oh, the slide is coming back up so that you'll be able to see the address there. Thank you. That's wonderful. Okay, just to mention as well that there's going to be the next talk, an additional talk from the one that we advertised earlier, which is going to be, I think, on the 3rd of November. It's going to be about spiders. So hold on to your seats. It's going to be Steph Pearce. If they're not your favourite creature, perhaps they will be by the time you've heard Steph's talk. So do join us for that. I hope you've really enjoyed this evening, everybody. I know I have. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And let's hope we can all get out there soon into Yorkshire, where, you know, who knows, perhaps in the next few years we might be hopeful that beavers might be reintroduced and we'll be able to see them as we wander about our own county. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was wonderful to hear your talk, and thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully see you next time.